The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine steps of the National Military Museum as Harold Hank slowly made his way up the granite staircase. His weathered hands gripped the brass handrail with each step, his old knees protesting the climb. At 82 years old, Hank carried himself with the dignity of a man who had served his country for over 3 decades, though his body bore the invisible scars of countless battles fought in jungles far from home. Today was special. The museum was hosting a ceremony to honor Vietnam War veterans, and Hank had traveled nearly 400 miles from his small apartment in rural Kansas just to be here. He wore his best suit, the navy blue one he saved for church and important occasions, with his bronze star and purple heart pinned carefully to his lapel. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite the early hour, his brown eyes held a spark of anticipation that had been missing for months. The invitation had arrived in his mailbox 3 weeks ago, printed on official museum letterhead with gold embossing. Hank had read it so many times the creases were beginning to wear thin. The National Military Museum cordially invites you to attend a special ceremony honoring the brave men and women who served in Vietnam. Those words had stirred something deep in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his wife passed away 2 years ago. As he reached the top of the steps, Hank paused to catch his breath and gazed up at the imposing building before him. The museum's facade was a testament to American military history, with towering columns and bronze sculptures depicting soldiers from different eras. He could see other veterans gathering near the entrance, some in wheelchairs, others walking with canes, all wearing their service medals with quiet pride. Hank approached the main entrance where a young security guard in a crisp uniform stood beside the electronic turnstiles. The guard, who couldn't have been more than 25, was checking bags and scanning tickets with mechanical efficiency. Behind him, museum staff members in matching polo shirts directed visitors toward different sections of the building. "Good morning," Hank said warmly as he reached the checkpoint. He fumbled in his jacket pocket for the invitation, his arthritic fingers making the simple task more difficult than it should have been. "I'm here for the Vietnam Veterans Ceremony." The security guard barely looked up from his clipboard. "I'll need to see your ticket, sir." Hank finally extracted the invitation from his pocket, the paper slightly crumpled from his nervous handling during the long bus ride. He presented it with a smile, expecting the same courteous treatment he had received at previous military events. The guard took the invitation and examined it with a frown. "This isn't a valid entry ticket," the guard said curtly, handing the paper back to Hank. "This is just an invitation. You need to have purchased an admission ticket online or at the box office." Hank's smile faltered. "But it says right here that I'm invited to the ceremony. I traveled all the way from Kansas for this." "Sir, invitations don't guarantee free admission to the museum. Everyone has to pay the entry fee, which is $25 for seniors." The guard's tone was impatient, as if he had explained this countless times before. The old veteran felt a flush of confusion and embarrassment creep up his neck. He had assumed, naturally, that an official invitation to honor his service would include admission to the ceremony. In his small town, when the VFW or the American Legion invited veterans to events, there was never a charge. I don't understand," Hank stammered. "The invitation doesn't mention anything about paying admission. I'm a Vietnam veteran, and this ceremony is supposed to honor veterans like me." "Look, sir, I don't make the rules. If you want to attend, you need to buy a ticket. The box office is over there." The guard pointed toward a small booth near the gift shop, where a short line of tourists waited. Hank's hands trembled slightly as he looked toward the box office, then back at the invitation. $25 might not seem like much to most people, but for Hank, living on a fixed income with mounting medical bills, it represented a significant expense. He had already spent most of his monthly entertainment budget on the bus ticket to get here. "Is there any way? Could I speak to someone in charge?" Hank asked quietly. "Maybe there's been some kind of mistake." The security guard sighed heavily. "Sir, you're holding up the line. Either buy a ticket or step aside." Behind Hank, other visitors were beginning to murmur impatiently. A family with young children shifted restlessly, and a group of college students checked their phones with obvious annoyance. The old veteran felt their eyes on him, and the shame burned hotter in his chest. "Please," Hank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I fought in Vietnam. I have my medals right here. This ceremony is for people like me." "I can see your medals, sir, but that doesn't change the admission policy." Everyone pays, veterans included. One of the museum staff members, a middle-aged woman with short hair, noticed the commotion and walked over. Her name tag read Susan Guest Services Manager. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone professional but not unkind. The security guard quickly explained the situation. "This gentleman has an invitation but no admission ticket. I've explained the policy, but he seems to think his military service should get him in for free." Susan looked at Hank with what might have been sympathy, but her response was practiced and firm. "I understand your confusion, Mr. Harold. Mr. The invitation is to inform you about the ceremony, but admission to the museum still requires a ticket purchase. We have many veterans who visit, and while we appreciate their service, we can't make exceptions to our admission policy." Hank felt something crumble inside him. He had been so looking forward to this day, had imagined walking through the halls of the museum, seeing exhibits about the war he had fought in, connecting with other veterans who understood what he had experienced. Now he stood there, publicly humiliated, his invitation worthless in his shaking hands. "I understand," he said quietly, though he didn't understand at all. "I guess I'll just head back home." As he turned to leave, Hank heard Susan say to the security guard, "Make sure to mark this down in the incident report. We're getting a lot of these confusion issues with the veteran invitations." The words hit Hank like a physical blow. He was just another incident to be documented and forgotten. His service, his medals, his long journey to be here, all reduced to a line in a report. He walked slowly back down the granite steps, each one feeling steeper than before. The morning sun that had seemed so promising an hour ago now felt harsh and unforgiving. Other veterans were still arriving, some in tour buses, others with family members helping them navigate the steps. They chatted excitedly about the ceremony, about finally being recognized for their service. Hank found a bench across the street from the museum and sat down heavily. He could see the activity at the entrance, the steady stream of people entering the building. Somewhere inside, preparations were being made for a ceremony that was supposed to honor him and thousands of others like him. But he would watch it from here, on a park bench, excluded from his own recognition. He pulled out his old flip phone and considered calling his neighbor, Mrs., who had offered to pick him up from the bus station when he returned. But he couldn't bear to explain what had happened, couldn't stand to see the pity in her kind eyes when she realized he had been turned away. Instead, he sat quietly on the bench, watching the world go by. Occasionally, other veterans would pass by on their way to the museum, and Hank would nod politely, pretending he was just taking a rest before going inside himself. The lie tasted bitter in his mouth, but it was easier than admitting the truth. As the morning wore on, Hank noticed a black sedan with government plates pull up to the museum's side entrance. Several men in military uniforms stepped out, their bearing unmistakably that of high-ranking officers. Even from across the street, Hank could see the stars on their shoulders glinting in the sunlight. These were the officials who would speak at the ceremony, the ones who would talk about honor and sacrifice and the debt America owed to its veterans. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he sat, one of the veterans they would speak about, unable to hear their words because he couldn't afford the price of admission to his own honor ceremony. Hank closed his eyes and let his mind drift back to Vietnam, to the humid jungle mornings when honor meant something simpler and more immediate than ceremonial speeches and museum exhibits. Back then, honor was about watching your buddies back, about doing your job even when you were scared, about coming home alive. It wasn't about having enough money to buy a ticket to be recognized for what you'd already done. The bench grew warmer as the sun climbed higher, and Hank realized he would need to start thinking about catching the afternoon bus back to Kansas. The return trip would give him plenty of time to figure out how to explain to his few remaining friends why his big day at the museum hadn't worked out as planned. But for now, he sat quietly, a forgotten soldier on a park bench, watching other people enter a building where his service was about to be celebrated without him. 20 minutes had passed since Hank settled onto the park bench when he noticed a young woman approaching. She wore a navy blue dress with a press badge hanging from a lanyard around her neck. Her brown hair was pulled back in a professional ponytail, and she carried a small notebook and a digital recorder. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested she took her work seriously. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely as she stopped in front of Hank's bench. "I'm Martinez from Channel 7 News. I'm here covering the Vietnam Veterans Ceremony at the museum. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions? Hank looked up at her, momentarily startled. He had been so lost in his thoughts that he hadn't noticed her approach. Oh, well, I suppose so, though I'm not sure I'm the person you want to talk to. Smiled warmly and gestured to the empty space on the bench beside him. May I sit down? I'm actually looking to interview veterans who are attending today's ceremony. I see your service medals there. Did you serve in Vietnam? I did, Hank replied, his voice carrying a mix of pride and sadness. 3 tour between 1969 and 1972, 1st Infantry Division. That's exactly what I was hoping to find, said, settling onto the bench and pulling out her notebook. The ceremony is starting in about an hour. Are you taking a break before going in or waiting for family members? Hank felt the familiar flush of embarrassment creep up his neck again. He looked down at his hands, studying the liver spots and wrinkles that told the story of his 82 years. Actually, miss, I won't be attending the ceremony. His pen stopped moving across her notepad. Oh, is there a scheduling conflict? No, nothing like that. Hank paused, struggling with whether to tell the truth to this earnest young reporter. Something in her genuine interest made him want to be honest. I can't afford the admission fee. The reporter's eyebrows rose in surprise. Admission fee, but surely for a ceremony honoring veterans. $25, Hank said quietly. I have an invitation, but they told me that doesn't include museum admission. Everyone has to pay, even the veterans being honored. Stared at him for a moment, her journalistic instincts clearly activated. Mr. Harold, but most folks call me Hank. Mister, are you telling me that you traveled here for a ceremony to honor your military service, but you're being charged admission to attend it? Hank nodded slowly. I came all the way from Kansas on the bus, used most of my monthly entertainment budget just to get here. I thought an invitation to honor my service would include the right to actually attend. Was writing furiously now. How much is $25 in terms of your monthly budget? Hank hesitated. He wasn't used to discussing his financial situation with strangers, but something about this young woman's genuine concern made him feel comfortable. I live on Social Security and a small military pension. After my rent, utilities, medications, and groceries, I don't have much left over. $25 is, well, it's what I spend on groceries for 3 days. And you made this trip specifically for this ceremony. It's the first time I've been invited to anything like this since I got back from Vietnam in 1972. My wife always said I should be more involved with veteran activities, but I never felt comfortable with groups and such. When this invitation came, though, Hank's voice trailed off as he pulled the crumpled paper from his pocket again. It felt important, like maybe it was time to connect with other people who understood what we went through over there. Studied the invitation carefully. This is official museum letterhead. The language certainly implies that you're being invited as a guest of honor. There's nothing here about admission fees. That's what I thought too, but the security guard said invitations don't mean free admission, said they get this confusion a lot. This confusion, repeated, making a note. So this has happened to other veterans. Apparently so. The guest services manager said they mark it down in incident reports when veterans show up thinking their invitations include admission. His expression darkened. Mister, would you be willing to go on camera with this story? I think the public should know what's happening here. Hank shifted uncomfortably on the bench. I don't know about that, miss. I'm not looking to cause trouble for anyone. Maybe I just misunderstood something. You didn't misunderstand anything, said firmly. This is wrong on multiple levels. A museum that receives federal funding is charging veterans to attend their own honor ceremony. That's a story the public needs to hear. As they talked, noticed more activity around the museum entrance. A small group of protesters had gathered near the main steps, holding signs about veteran rights and military funding. She recognized some of them as local veteran advocates who often showed up at military-related events. Are those protesters connected to what happened to you? She asked. Hank looked across the street and shook his head. No, I don't think so. They were there when I arrived this morning, probably protesting something else entirely. Stood up and extended her business card to Hank. Mister, I'm going to do some investigating. Can I get your contact information? I'd like to follow up on this story. Hank took the card and gave her his phone number and address. I don't have one of those email things, but you can call me at home. I will definitely call you. In the meantime, please don't leave just yet. I want to see if I can get some answers from the museum administration. Walked briskly toward the museum, her reporter's instincts fully engaged. This wasn't just a human interest story about a disappointed veteran. This was a story about institutional failures and misplaced priorities. She approached the main entrance where the same security guard who had turned Hank away was still checking tickets. "Excuse me," she said, showing her press credentials. "I'm with Channel 7 News, here to cover the veterans' ceremony. I was hoping to speak with someone in museum administration about your admission policies for invited veterans." The security guard looked nervous. "You'd need to talk to the public relations department for any official statements, there on the third floor." Thanked him and entered the museum. The lobby was bustling with activity as staff members made final preparations for the ceremony. Veteran families were already gathering in the main hall, and she could hear the sound check for the audio system echoing through the building. She took the elevator to the third floor and found the public relations office. A receptionist directed her to Maria Santos, the museum's director of communications, who was busy coordinating media coverage of the ceremony. "Ms. Santos, I'm Martinez from Channel 7. I'm here covering the veterans' ceremony, but I've encountered a concerning situation that I'd like to get your comment on." Maria looked up from her computer screen. "Of course, what kind of situation?" "I just interviewed an 82-year-old Vietnam veteran named Harold who traveled from Kansas for today's ceremony. He has an official invitation from your museum, but he was entry because he couldn't pay the $25 admission fee. He's currently sitting on a bench across the street because he can't afford to attend the ceremony honoring his own service." Maria's expression shifted from professional courtesy to obvious concern. "That doesn't sound right. Our invitations for honor ceremonies typically include complimentary admission for the veterans being recognized." "Well, it appears your security staff and guest services manager aren't aware of that policy. Mr. was told that invitations don't guarantee free admission and that everyone has to pay, veterans included." Maria was already reaching for her phone. "Can you give me a few minutes to look into this? There may have been a miscommunication with our front desk staff." "I can wait, but I should mention that Mr. indicated this has happened to other veterans as well. Your guest services manager mentioned marking these incidents in reports." The color drained slightly from Maria's face. "I'll need to investigate this immediately. Would you mind waiting in the conference room next door while I make some calls?" Agreed and was escorted to a small conference room with a view of the park across the street. She could see Hank still sitting on his bench, occasionally checking his old flip phone. The sight of the elderly veteran waiting patiently outside his own honor ceremony made her more determined to get to the bottom of this story. Through the thin walls, she could hear Maria Santos making increasingly urgent phone calls. Words like incident reports, policy clarification, and potential PR disaster filtered through the walls. After about 15 minutes, Maria returned to the conference room with a folder of documents and a grim expression. "Ms. Martinez, I've reviewed our policies and spoken with several staff members. It appears there has been a significant miscommunication regarding our veteran honor ceremonies. Our official policy does provide complimentary admission for veterans with official invitations to these events, but that information was not properly communicated to our frontline staff." "How many veterans has this affected?" asked. Maria consulted her folder. Based on the incident reports from this morning alone, at least 12 veterans with invitations were charged admission or turned away. Over the past month, since we began this series of honor ceremonies, the number appears to be much higher. And these incident reports were filed, but no one thought to investigate why so many veterans were confused about the admission policy. That's a fair question, and I don't have a good answer for it right now." Made detailed notes as Maria explained the museum's efforts to contact the affected veterans and offer refunds. But she knew the real story was sitting on a bench across the street, a proud man who had served his country and been treated as an inconvenience when he tried to attend his own recognition ceremony. "I'd like to bring Mr. inside now if that's possible," said. "He's been waiting out there for over an hour." "Absolutely. I'll escort him personally and make sure he has VIP treatment for the rest of the day." As they prepared to go retrieve Hank, realized this story was bigger than just one museum's policy confusion. It was about how America treats its veterans, about the gap between ceremonial honor and practical respect. And she was determined to tell it in a way that would make people pay attention. Maria Santos and Martinez walked briskly across the street toward Hank's bench, but they weren't the only ones heading in his direction. A tall man in an expensive suit had also noticed the elderly veteran and was approaching from the opposite direction. Recognized him immediately from his frequent appearances on local news programs, always positioned strategically behind podiums at political events or walking importantly through government buildings. Congressman Bradley represented the district that included the museum, and his political career had been built largely on his reputation as a supporter of military causes. He was in his early 50s, with perfectly styled gray hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of public speaking. Today, he wore an American flag pin on his lapel and carried himself with the purposeful stride of someone who knew cameras might be watching. Mr. Congressman called out as he reached the bench first, extending his hand with a politician's practiced smile. "I'm Congressman Brad. I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding about your admission to the museum today." Hank looked up, surprised by the sudden attention. "Well, yes, sir, there was some confusion about the invitation, but these ladies are helping sort it out." Glanced at Maria, and as they approached, his smile faltering slightly when he noticed press badge. "I see we have media here. Ms. Martinez, isn't it? Channel 7. "That's right, Congressman. I'm covering the veterans' ceremony, and I happened to meet Mr. while he was waiting outside because he couldn't afford the admission fee." His political instincts kicked into overdrive. He could see the potential headlines already, and none of them would be favorable for someone who had built his career on supporting veterans. "Well, that's absolutely unacceptable. Mister, as a veteran who served our country with honor, you should never have to pay to attend a ceremony recognizing your service." Maria stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Congressman, I'm Maria Santos, the museum's Director of Communications. We've already identified the policy miscommunication that caused this situation, and we're working to rectify it immediately." "Policy miscommunication?" His voice took on the indignant tone he typically reserved for congressional hearings. "This is a travesty. A man who fought for our freedom in Vietnam should be welcomed with open arms, not turned away because of bureaucratic failures." Hank shifted uncomfortably on the bench. The attention was overwhelming, and he wasn't sure he liked being the center of what was clearly becoming a larger controversy. "Really, everyone, I don't want to cause any trouble. Maybe I should just head on home." "Absolutely not," declared, placing a protective hand on Hank's shoulder for the cameras he assumed were rolling, though hadn't yet taken out her equipment. "This is exactly the kind of institutional failure that I've been fighting against in Congress. Our veterans deserve better than this." Watched the interaction with professional interest. Was clearly in full political mode, but she wondered if he genuinely cared about Hank's situation or was simply positioning himself for maximum political advantage. "Congressman, were you aware that this appears to be an ongoing issue? According to museum records, multiple veterans have been affected by this policy confusion over the past several weeks." His expression darkened. "This is the first I'm hearing of it, but you can be sure I'll be launching a full investigation. Federal funding should not be going to institutions that disrespect our veterans." Maria looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Congressman, I think there may be some of the situation here. This was a training issue with our frontline staff, not a systemic disrespect for veterans." "Training issue?" His voice rose slightly. "Mister, how does it feel to be called a training issue?" Hank looked confused and a bit distressed by the escalating rhetoric. I just wanted to attend the ceremony. I don't understand why everyone's getting so upset." Realized that the situation was spiraling away from the actual story. Was turning Hank's personal disappointment into political theater, while the museum administration was going into damage control mode. The real issue, an elderly veteran's dignified handling of an embarrassing situation, was getting lost in the noise. "Perhaps we could focus on getting Mr. inside for the ceremony he came to attend," she suggested. "The event is scheduled to start in 30 minutes. "Excellent idea," agreed quickly. "Mister, it would be my honor to escort you into the museum personally. As a matter of fact, I'd like you to be my special guest for the ceremony. You'll sit with the VIP section." Hank looked overwhelmed. "That's very kind of you, sir, but I'm not sure I belong in the VIP section. I was just a regular soldier." "There's no such thing as just a regular soldier, mister. Every man and woman who served in Vietnam is a hero in my book." As the group began walking toward the museum, noticed that it positioned himself strategically between her and Hank, effectively controlling the narrative. She also observed that a small crowd had gathered near the museum entrance, drawn by the commotion. Some were other veterans who had heard about the situation, while others appeared to be museum staff members trying to assess the scope of the public relations crisis. Inside the museum lobby, the scene was controlled chaos. Maria Santos was fielding phone calls from what appeared to be senior museum officials, while other staff members whispered urgently among themselves. The veterans who had successfully gained admission earlier were beginning to gather in the main ceremonial hall, unaware of the drama unfolding in the lobby. Made a show of personally ensuring that Hank was registered as his guest, loudly instructing museum staff to treat this American hero with the respect he deserves. Hank accepted the attention with quiet grace, but could see that he was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with being the center of such a spectacle. "Mister," she said quietly, pulling him aside while was busy giving quotes to other reporters who had arrived. "How are you feeling about all this attention?" Hank looked around at the bustling activity, the photographers, and the officials all suddenly interested in his situation. "Honestly, miss, I'm a bit overwhelmed. I just wanted to sit quietly in the back and listen to the speakers. I never expected all this fuss." "Do you feel like the attention is helping or making things more complicated?" "Well, I suppose I'm grateful to finally be inside the museum, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It feels like people are more interested in making points than in actually understanding what happened here." Nodded, appreciating his thoughtful response. "What would you want people to understand?" "That there are probably other veterans out there who went through the same thing I did, but they just went home quietly. They didn't have a reporter and a congressman show up to help them. What about those folks?" His words struck as profoundly insightful. While everyone was focusing on Hank's individual case, the larger issue was the systematic nature of the problem and the veterans who had simply accepted their exclusion without complaint. Before she could respond, returned with a small entourage of museum officials and other politicians who had heard about the situation. "Mister, I'd like you to meet the museum director, Dr. Elizabeth, and City Council member Sarah. They wanted to personally apologize for what happened to you today." Doctor, a distinguished woman in her 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward with obvious embarrassment. "Mister, please accept my apologies for the confusion and disrespect you experienced today. This does not represent the values of our institution or our feelings toward veterans." "Thank you, ma'am," Hank replied politely. "I appreciate that. We're immediately implementing new training procedures for all staff members and reviewing our communication materials to ensure this never happens again." City Council member added, "We're also looking at expanding our support programs for veterans in the community. Your experience today has highlighted some gaps in our services." As more officials offered apologies and promised reforms, noticed that Hank was beginning to look tired. The morning's emotional roller coaster, combined with his age and the overwhelming attention, was clearly taking a toll on him. "Perhaps Mister would like to rest for a few minutes before the ceremony begins," she suggested. "Of course," Doctor agreed immediately. "We have a VIP lounge where you can relax with some refreshments." As they escorted Hank toward the VIP area, pulled aside. "I hope you'll include in your story how quickly we responded to this situation once it was brought to our attention. This is exactly the kind of advocacy work I've been doing for veterans throughout my time in Congress." Nodded noncommittally, but she was already thinking about how to frame the story. Whilst intervention had ultimately helped Hank gain admission to the ceremony, she wondered whether the congressman's primary concern was actually for the veteran or for his own political image. The real story, she was beginning to realize, wasn't just about one veteran's disappointment or even about institutional failures. It was about the complex dynamics of how America treats its veterans, the gap between public rhetoric about supporting the military and the reality of bureaucratic indifference, and the quiet dignity of people like Hank who serve their country and ask for very little in return. As she watched Hank being settled into the VIP lounge with a cup of coffee and a comfortable chair, surrounded by officials eager to make amends for their earlier dismissal, knew she had found a story worth telling. But she also knew that the most important part of that story was still to come. The VIP lounge was a quiet sanctuary compared to the chaos in the museum lobby. Hank sat in a comfortable leather armchair, sipping coffee from a china cup and trying to process the whirlwind of the past hour. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the main ceremonial hall where museum staff were making final preparations for the program. A military honor guard was practicing their entrance, and technicians were adjusting microphones at the podium. Had remained with him, partly to continue her interview, but mostly because she sensed that Hank needed someone who wasn't trying to use his story for political or institutional purposes. She sat across from him in another armchair, her recorder resting on the small table between them. "Mister, can I ask you about your time in Vietnam? You mentioned you served 3 tours." Hank's weathered face grew thoughtful. "I was drafted in 1968, right after high school. Wasn't planning on making a career out of it, but I kept re-enlisting because my unit needed experienced soldiers, and frankly, I was good at keeping the younger guys alive." "What was your role?" "Started as a rifleman, ended up as a squad leader. Did a lot of patrol work in the Mekong Delta region. Lost some good friends over there." His voice carried the weight of memories that had never fully faded. "When I came home in 1972, it wasn't exactly a hero's welcome, if you know what I mean." Nodded, aware of the difficult homecoming many Vietnam veterans had experienced. "Is that why today's ceremony was so important to you?" "Partly, yes. My wife, she always said that someday the country would recognize what we went through over there. She passed 2 years ago, and I thought maybe this ceremony would be a way to honor her faith in that idea." Before could respond, there was a commotion outside the lounge. Through the glass doors, they could see several military officers in dress uniforms walking quickly through the corridor. Even from a distance, the stars on their shoulders were visible, indicating high rank. Doctor appeared at the lounge door, looking slightly breathless. "Mister, there's been an unexpected development. General, the ceremony's keynote speaker, has requested to meet with you personally before the program begins." Hank looked confused. "I don't understand. Why would a general want to meet with me?" "Apparently, she heard about what happened this morning and specifically asked to speak with you." Doctor paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I should mention that General is Congressman's sister, though she had no role in his involvement today." Journalistic instincts perked up. This added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. "Would it be all right if I accompanied Mister for this meeting?" "I'll have to ask the General's staff, but I imagine it would be fine." A few minutes later, they were escorted to a smaller conference room where General was waiting. She was an imposing figure even out of uniform context, standing about 5'8" with graying auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her dress uniform was impeccable, with ribbons and decorations that spoke of a distinguished 30-year career. Unlike her politician brother, her presence conveyed earned authority rather than practiced charisma. "Mister," she said, rising to shake his hand. "I'm General. I understand you've had a difficult morning, and I wanted to apologize personally for the way you were treated." Hank stood as well, his old military bearing evident as he shook her hand. "Thank you, ma'am, though I have to say everyone's been very kind since the misunderstanding was cleared up." "May I ask you to sit down? I'd like to hear what happened in your own words, if you don't mind." As Hank recounted the morning's events, General listened without interruption. Her expression grew increasingly serious as he described being turned away at the entrance and spending an hour on the park bench across the street. "Mister, in what unit did you serve in Vietnam?" "1st Infantry Division, ma'am. 1st Battalion, 16th Infantry Regiment." The general's eyebrows rose slightly. "The big red one? You were in some heavy fighting then, Fire Base Charlie." "Yes, ma'am, you know about Fire Base Charlie. I've studied that engagement extensively. It was part of my master's thesis at the War College. Your battalion held off a much larger force for 3 days until reinforcements could arrive. Significant tactical victory." Hank looked surprised. "I didn't know anyone still studied that battle. It wasn't one of the famous ones you see in the movies." "Mister, engagements like Fire Base Charlie won't make Hollywood films, but they represent the backbone of military effectiveness, small unit actions, where experienced soldiers kept their people alive and completed their missions under impossible circumstances." watched this interaction with fascination. This was clearly a very different conversation than the political posturing that had occurred earlier. General was speaking to Hank as one soldier to another, with a professional respect that transcended rank or ceremony. "Ma'am," Hank said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think what happened to me today? Do you think it means anything, or am I making too much of a simple mistake?" General was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "Mister, I think it means several things. First, it demonstrates that despite all our ceremonies and speeches, we still have institutional failures in how we treat veterans. Second, it shows that bureaucratic indifference can be just as hurtful as active hostility." She paused, looking directly at him. "But most importantly, your response to what happened says everything about the character that made you an effective soldier 50 years ago. You didn't rage or make demands or storm off in anger. You accepted disappointment with dignity and were prepared to go home quietly. That's the mark of a professional soldier." Hank's eyes grew slightly misty. "Thank you for saying that, ma'am. I have a request to make of you, mister. I'd planned to give a fairly standard speech today about sacrifice and service. Instead, I'd like to tell your story as part of my remarks. Not the political circus that happened afterward, but the real story about a veteran who traveled 400 miles to be recognized, was turned away through institutional failure, and handled that disappointment with the same grace he brought to his military service." I don't know about that, General. I'm not much of a public speaker." "I'm not asking you to speak. I'm asking for your permission to use your story as an example of both the problems we need to fix and the character we need to celebrate." Hank looked uncertain, so spoke up. "Mister, what the General is suggesting could help ensure that other veterans don't experience what you did today." "Well," Hank said slowly, "if you think it might help other folks, then I suppose that would be all right." General smiled, the first genuine warmth she had shown during the meeting. "Thank you. And mister, I have one more request. Would you be willing to join me on stage during my remarks? Not to speak, just to stand with me while I tell your story." "Oh no, ma'am, I couldn't do that. I'd be too nervous." "I understand, but would you consider it? It would send a powerful message about the gap between how we honor veterans in theory and how we treat them in practice." Before Hank could answer, there was a knock on the conference room door. A young military aide entered and whispered something to General. Her expression changed immediately from warm to stern. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, stepping outside the room with the aide. Through the partially open door, could hear fragments of an urgent conversation. Words like media circus, political interference, and ceremony integrity drifted into the room. It sounded like someone was pressuring the General to modify her planned remarks. When she returned a few minutes later, General's jaw was set in a way that suggested she had made a decision that not everyone was going to like. "Mister, it appears that some people are concerned about my plan to discuss your situation during my speech. They feel it might be too political or controversial for a veteran's ceremony." "Maybe they're right," Hank said. "I don't want to cause any more trouble." "With respect, mister, you haven't caused any trouble. You've revealed a problem that needed to be addressed, and sometimes addressing problems requires making people uncomfortable." She turned to, "Ms. Martinez, I assume you'll be covering my remarks." "Yes, ma'am. Will you still be telling Mister's story?" General's smile was grim but determined. "Oh, yes. In fact, I think I'm going to tell it in much more detail than I originally planned." As they prepared to leave the conference room and head to the main ceremony hall, realized that what had started as a simple story about a veteran's disappointment had evolved into something much larger. It was now a story about institutional courage, about the difference between real honor and ceremonial honor, and about what happens when people in positions of authority decide to do the right thing regardless of political consequences. The ceremony was about to begin, but suspected that the real story was just getting started. The main ceremonial hall was filled to capacity as the Vietnam Veterans Ceremony began. Red, white, and blue bunting decorated the walls, and large American flags flanked the stage where a podium had been set up between two honor guards. The audience was a mixture of veterans, their families, museum donors, and local dignitaries, all settling into their seats as a military brass ensemble played patriotic hymns. Hank sat in the front row VIP section, still somewhat overwhelmed by his transformation from rejected visitor to guest of honor. Congressman had positioned himself nearby, continuing to provide commentary to reporters about his advocacy for veterans' rights. Sat with the press section, her camera crew now recording the event after her producer had recognized the broader story potential. Doctor served as the ceremony's host, welcoming the audience and providing background on the museum's commitment to honoring veterans. She spoke about sacrifice and service, about the importance of remembering history, and about the debt of gratitude America owed to those who had served in Vietnam. Her words were sincere but generic, the kind of safe rhetoric common to such events. Several local officials offered brief remarks, each emphasizing their support for veterans while carefully avoiding anything that might be construed as controversial. Congressman spoke for 10 minutes about legislation he had sponsored and programs he had supported, managing to mention his own name more frequently than he referenced actual veterans. Then Doctor introduced General. Ladies, and our keynote speaker today is a distinguished military leader with over 30 years of service, including multiple combat deployments and senior command positions. Please welcome General. The audience rose in respectful applause as General approached the podium. She looked out over the crowd with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to addressing large groups, but there was something different in her expression today, a seriousness that went beyond ceremonial duty. "Thank you for that warm welcome," she began. "I had prepared remarks today about the valor and sacrifice of our Vietnam veterans, about their courage under fire and their dedication to duty. Those words are true and important, and I will speak them before I finish." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "But first, I want to tell you about something that happened this morning, right here at this museum, that illustrates both the challenges our veterans continue to face and the character that makes them worthy of our highest honor." In the front row, Hank shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had hoped the general might mention his situation briefly, but her tone suggested something more substantial was coming. At approximately 8:30 this morning, an 82-year-old Vietnam veteran named Harold climbed the steps of this museum. Mr. had traveled 400 miles from rural Kansas on a bus, using most of his monthly entertainment budget, because he had received an official invitation to attend this ceremony honoring his service. The audience was listening attentively, though many seemed unsure where the story was heading. Mr. served 3 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Infantry Division. He was at Fire Base Charlie, where his battalion held off a superior enemy force for 3 days, preventing a strategic breakthrough that could have cost hundreds of American lives. He earned a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart, and more importantly, he earned the respect of the soldiers who served under his leadership. General's voice carried the authority of military experience as she continued. When Mr. reached the entrance of this museum this morning, carrying his official invitation to a ceremony honoring his service, he was told that he would need to pay $25 for admission. $25 that he didn't have, because as someone living on Social Security and a small military pension, $25 represents his grocery budget for 3 days. A murmur went through the audience. Some people looked confused, others appeared shocked, and a few were already shaking their heads in disapproval. Mr. sat on a park bench across the street for over an hour, watching other people enter the building where his service was about to be honored. He didn't complain. He didn't demand to speak to supervisors. He didn't call reporters or politicians. He simply accepted that he would watch his own recognition ceremony from outside because he couldn't afford the price of admission. In the VIP section, Congressman was looking increasingly uncomfortable. This was not the kind of safe, patriotic rhetoric he had expected from a military ceremony. "Now I want to be clear about something," General continued, her voice growing stronger. "This was not a malicious act by museum staff. It was a policy failure, a training failure, a communication failure. But it was also something more fundamental. It was a failure to understand that honor is not just about ceremonies and speeches and flag-draped stages. Honor is about how we treat people when no one important is watching." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Mr. Story came to light today only because a dedicated journalist happened to notice an elderly man sitting alone on a park bench and bothered to ask him why he wasn't inside. How many other veterans have faced similar situations and simply gone home quietly? How many have been excluded from their own recognition because of bureaucratic indifference or policy failures? Doctor, sitting in the front row with other museum officials, looked deeply uncomfortable. This was far from the positive publicity event she had planned. "But here's what I want you to understand about Harold and veterans like him," General said, her gaze finding Hank in the audience. When faced with disappointment and disrespect, his response was characterized by the same quiet dignity that marked his military service. He didn't rage or demand special treatment. He was prepared to accept exclusion with grace and go home without complaint. She paused, letting that sink in. That, ladies and is the character of the men and women we honor today. They serve without expectation of reward. They sacrifice without demanding recognition. They face disappointment with dignity. And when we fail them, as we did Mister this morning, they don't hold it against us. General looked directly at the museum officials in the front row. But we should hold it against ourselves, because honoring our veterans means more than annual ceremonies and patriotic speeches. It means treating them with respect every day, in every interaction, whether they're wearing uniforms or civilian clothes, whether they're young or old, whether they can afford admission fees or not. The audience was beginning to understand that this was not going to be a typical ceremony. Several people were taking notes and could see other reporters typing urgently on their phones. "I've spent 30 years in the military," General continued. "I've seen courage under fire, leadership under pressure, and sacrifice beyond measure. But I've rarely seen character displayed as clearly as Harold displayed it this morning, sitting quietly on a park bench outside his own honor ceremony, accepting disappointment without bitterness." She turned toward Hank. "Mister, would you please stand?" Hank looked startled and shook his head slightly, but the audience was already beginning to applaud. Reluctantly, he rose from his seat, his face flushed with embarrassment but his bearing still dignified. "Ladies and Harold represents everything we claim to honor about our veterans. Service without expectation of reward, dignity in the face of disappointment, grace under pressure, character that endures long after the uniforms are put away." The applause grew louder and more sustained. People throughout the audience were rising to their feet, and Hank stood there, clearly overwhelmed by the attention, but accepting it with the same quiet dignity that had marked his response to being turned away earlier. "Mr. General said as the applause died down, on behalf of a grateful nation and a chastened institution, thank you for your service, thank you for your character, and thank you for reminding us what honor really looks like." As Hank sat down, General returned to her prepared remarks about Vietnam veterans, but the tone of the entire ceremony had been transformed. Her words about sacrifice and service now carried a weight of authenticity that resonated throughout the hall. When the ceremony concluded, people didn't file out quietly as they typically did after such events. Instead, many approached Hank directly, shaking his hand and thanking him. Other veterans shared their own stories of bureaucratic frustrations and institutional indifference. Family members talked about the difficulties their loved ones had faced in accessing services or recognition. Doctor approached Hank with obvious sincerity. "Mister, I want to personally ensure that your experience today leads to meaningful changes in how we operate this museum. Would you be willing to serve on an advisory committee to help us review our policies and procedures?" Hank looked surprised. "I don't know much about running museums, ma'am." "You know about being treated with dignity and respect. That's exactly the expertise we need." As the crowd gradually dispersed, conducted final interviews with various participants. General spoke candidly about the gap between ceremonial honor and practical respect for veterans. Doctor outlined specific policy changes the museum would implement. Congressman tried to maintain that his intervention had been crucial, though his claims seemed hollow after his sister's pointed remarks about substantive versus superficial support. But the most telling interview was with Hank himself, as he prepared to catch his bus back to Kansas. "Mister, how do you feel about everything that happened today?" Hank considered the question carefully. "Well, I suppose I'm grateful it worked out the way it did, but I keep thinking about all the other veterans who went through something similar and just went home quietly. Maybe if this helps them somehow, then it was worth all the fuss." "Do you feel like justice was served?" "I don't know about justice. I just hope people learn something. Not just about museum policies, but about paying attention to folks who don't make a lot of noise when they're treated poorly." As Hank climbed onto the bus for his long journey home, he carried with him not just the memory of being honored, but the knowledge that his quiet dignity in the face of disappointment had sparked a larger conversation about how America treats its veterans. Watched the bus pull away, knowing she had witnessed something rare. A moment when institutional failure had been transformed into institutional learning, when individual character had illuminated systemic problems, and when a simple act of journalistic curiosity had revealed a story that needed to be told. The ceremony was over, but the real work of honoring veterans with more than words was just beginning.